Welcome to Heller-Hurwicz Office Hours, a podcast featuring University of Minnesota affiliated economists and their research. In this special series of the podcast, we're focusing on the policy priorities of the second Trump administration and how research can inform our understanding of a rapidly changing economic environment. U.S. births have been on the decline for decades, now falling below what is considered the replacement level rate, with major potential consequences for society. If the birth rate stays at the current level or continues to decline, the nation could face lower economic growth and serious fiscal challenges. Policymakers across the political spectrum have voiced increasing concerns about this issue and proposed a wide variety of solutions. Better understanding the key drivers underlying the declining birth rate could inform the development of effective policies to address it. In this conversation, Professor Michèle Tertilt will discuss what economic analysis can reveal about fertility, her recent research on one overlooked reason for low fertility rates, and the potential public policy implications. Well, welcome.
Hello.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And just, I was looking at some data, and so about 2/3 of people now live in countries where fertility is below the replacement rate of 2.1 births per woman, which is a standard estimate, as I gather, of what's needed to maintain a stable population. So why is the replacement rate important? Why does this concept, much of this literature focuses on?
Well, so the replacement rate is what is needed to maintain a stable population. So in the limit, in the long run, if fertility is below that, the planet will be shrinking, and in the limit, eventually it'll be empty.
And so, using your economic analysis, what are some of the key drivers behind the decline in population growth and decline in the birth rate?
Yeah, so that depends on whether we're talking about the historical decline or sort of the currently low numbers.
So first, let's start out with the historic decline. Yeah.
Yeah. So historically, people had many kids. Let's say on average 6 kids per couple, per woman, and that has been declining over several centuries by now. And it has many reasons, but one of the most important factors is the so-called quantity-quality trade-off. So as returns to education have been going up, families opted for more education and fewer children. And that was, of course, also, related to moving from the farms to the cities, so structural change. Now, of course, another factor is declines in child mortality, and then also more recently, sort of changes in female labor force participation. So the opportunity cost of time has been also a very important concept. So as more women are working, sort of having children becomes relatively more expensive because you're giving up the income of the woman. And so that's another factor of that historical decline.
And has that factor become more important in recent history?
It's become more important, but in a more nuanced way, I would argue. So initially, it was about women working or not working. Now it's more about women having a career. So these days, the aspirations of women and men are very similar. Everyone wants, have a good career and a family. And so then what's become really important in recent time, the ability to combine a career with a family and the factors that facilitate that, or actually put an obstacle to that.
And so when the discussion about the fertility rate, I was looking at Elon Musk, for example. I think everybody knows who Elon Musk is. He's been saying, this fertility collapse is the greatest risk to the future of civilization. And, there's a number of other people out there who are extremely concerned about it. So what is the concern?
Yes, so I would somewhat disagree with this extreme concern. I think one major concern is just simply the sustainability of the pension system. Social Security, can we afford that? And obviously, it's much easier to maintain if you have higher birth. And if births are shrinking, then who's going to pay? Who's going to pay into the pay-as-you-go system? But then there are other dimensions, right? We could also just work longer. We could contribute more, we could reduce payouts. So there's a bunch of dimensions that we could adjust. But I think in terms of politics, that is the major concern. Now, Elon Musk and some other economists, some people are also pushing, they're raising another concern they're worried about innovation. So the idea that we need, that innovation is a function of the number of people, and that we'd be running out of ideas if the planet is shrinking. In the limit, of course, it's probably true. If we're left with 100 people, how many engineers are there on the planet to come up with new ideas? But, right now, whether it's a few more or less, I haven't seen the evidence that really proves that point.
And one thing I was just curious when I was reading your research with, and we're living in this era of AI, and we don't know exactly what that means, right? But does productivity trump demographics when we're thinking about some of the economic implications of a decline in fertility? How does productivity play into the analysis, if it does?
Yeah, that's a subtle point or a subtle question. So some people are concerned so the age ratio is different. The workforce is older, right? Fertility is low. And to the extent you think older people are less productive, that could be sort of a way of decreasing productivity. But it's actually not so obvious because older people are also a lot more experienced. I don't really see the impact on productivity directly.
So tell me a little about your research and status anxiety. What is status anxiety?
So status concern, comparison motive. So this is an old idea dating back to Veblen that people are really concerned about not just well-being, but relative status. So how well they're doing, relative to other people. Who has the biggest house? Who has the biggest car? So that's an old idea. What's new, the point that we're raising is that people also feel very competitive and have these sort of comparison motive when it comes to their kids. So people compare the education of their children and the outcomes of their children relative to other people's children. And so if your neighbors, your friends, your colleagues, if they're, spending a lot of time and money and trying to get their kids into the best high schools, the best colleges, then others try to keep up and also spend a lot of time and money on them. And that's sort of the idea we're after.
Okay, so, and then how does that feed into the decline in fertility?
So the idea is that people spend a lot of time and money on their children. Well, that makes them very expensive. And if you have expensive children, then you can't afford many. So that leads people to have, stop after one or two, or some people even thinking, that ideal child that I want, I can't afford, so I won't gonna have any. And so a prime example or like the poster child of sort of this happening, I think, is in East Asia, especially Korea, Korea has the lowest birth rate in the world right now with 0.75 children per woman. So per couple, right? This is less than half the replacement rate, super low. And it's also an area where, education has gone crazy. Kids in middle school, so small children, they go to cram school until really late at night. They're studying all the time, and it's expensive on the parents. So these are really expensive private tutoring centers that a lot of people attend, and so then they feel like they can't afford children anymore.
And so in your study of South Korea, how did you, gather your data to support the thesis or the hypothesis about status anxiety?
Yeah, so we looked at several different surveys. So other researchers collecting data and asking questions. So among other things, we had a surveys on how much people spend on education and also how late the kids were actually attending these cram schools. And then we could use a sort of a natural experiment. So there was actually some policy changes in Korea. They put some curfews on the opening hours of the cram schools, and so that they couldn't open after 10 or 9. And these curfews were imposed in different regions or different states in different years and also different times. So some 9, some 10, some 11. And so we could exploit that variation to see how people react in the following sense. So, it's the richest and the most educated parents who send the kids to the cram schools until late at night. Why? Because they want the most hours. So, right, if you're going to just send them like 2 or 3 hours a day, and then you can squeeze that still into the early evening or the afternoon. But if you're going to send them for 8 hours, then you have to run until 10 or 11, right? So it's the richest and most educated families that were forced to cut back. And then what we analyzed is how that was affecting the people, the families that hadn't been going so late. So in principle, if it was just the curfews, these other families shouldn't be affected at all because they were going only until, let's say, 7 or 8 p.m. and the curfew was beyond that. But what we found in the data is that also these poorer and less educated families in sync cut back in line with, other people cutting back these super long hours. And so we think that's pretty strong evidence for this comparison motive for some actual externalities, so that people were just sending kids so late to keep up.
And so taking that background, now looking at the US, is there similar evidence? Is it among wealthier people in the United States? So where do you see the status anxiety here in the US?
So in the latest paper that we wrote together with 2 co-authors, we're trying to make the point that this is relevant beyond Korea and beyond East Asia. And so we look both across countries and also specifically in the United States. So, well, of course, it's hard to really prove this, but we found a lot of suggestive evidence. So one piece of evidence that I found particularly striking was the following. So first of all, we need a good proxy for comparison motives, right? How to measure them. That's not so easy, but we found some really interesting data from Rush Chetty and co-authors, and they had data from Facebook friendships. So what they created is an index called economic connectedness, and that's what measures what fraction of your friends are from a higher socioeconomic status, Facebook friends. And so if you have a lot of friends from a higher socioeconomic status, you might be looking up to them. And so we used that measure and looked at how it correlates with fertility. And so we actually found that those counties in the United States that had a lot of economic connectedness, meaning a lot of people looking up to higher socioeconomic status friends, had the lowest birth rates. And this effect was quite sizable. So if I'm looking at a very connected county, birth rates, meaning children born per 1,000 women of childbearing age in a given year, was about 50. And if I'm going to a county that's much less connected, sort of at the other end of the distribution, it was about 60. So that's quite a sizable gap.
And it's a sizable gap. And so it kind of raises the question of, is there a normative aspect to this? It's always hard to talk about children and families without getting into the normative. But, part of when you were talking, I was thinking, well, could be some very good reasons. This isn't fueling social mobility. This is fueling, I'm going to get, my children are going to get better educated. So I'm kind of curious how you navigate that, that aspect of this whole discussion.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I really think we need to get into the normative aspects. Otherwise, we can't even talk about fertility being too low or too high or being a concern, right? So if we think it's a concern, we better figure out why. And so this particular theory, this comparison motive, does suggest that maybe we are over-investing in children, and we would all be better off if we somehow agreed to do a little bit less. Now, I realize that is a tricky issue. Usually, we think of education a good thing. It raises human capital. It raises standard of living. I mean, I'm a university professor. Of course, I believe in education. So it's a bit hard to argue that we should educate less and put a tax on education. So I realize it's a subtle issue. But let me point out that not all of what's considered educational investment actually increases human capital. So think about people applying for college and spending tons of time studying for the SAT score test. Is it really, it's going to make them better test takers, but are they learning anything new? I don't think so. or if they actually hire a tutor to help them write the essay to get into college. That tutor might be very expensive, but the tutor is writing the essay, so that's not going to make the child a better essay writer. So I think there are some dimensions in which, there's really excesses into, child investment that, in some kind of way is not really increasing their true education. And I can give you more examples from other countries.
No, exactly. Give some of those examples from other countries.
Yes, I was talking to my Korean co-authors, so there where it's really gone crazy. So parents and especially mothers spend a lot of time even preparing very elaborate, home-cooked meals for the kids to take to school, and they're competing about the lunch boxes, basically. That's not going to make the kids, again, learn more at school.
Yeah, no, and are there also other implications outside of education, but in terms of thinking about the public policy?
Yeah, and I guess in the end, it's all about education, or in a very broad sense. I think we really need to think about what these excesses do also to the children themselves. So we found a lot of evidence that, it's not good for their mental health, studying all day long. That's also another dimension of well-being in the long run. We want well-rounded people and not just educated in a kind of narrow sense. So if they're all suffering from mental health problems, that's bad. Or if, kids spend all day studying and, gain a lot of weight because they're not exercising anymore, this maybe, we need more research on this, but maybe this has also been contributing to rise in obesity rates. And especially in East Asia, there's some evidence it's been related to the rise in myopia. So now, nearsightedness is maybe not the worst thing in the world, but it's been really increasing in just one generation by large numbers. And it seems to be related to people at certain ages not going outside anymore, not seeing daylight.
Yeah. So, and tell me where I'm going wrong on this, but it seems that you look at the fertility rate, decline in fertility rate, and one aspect of this, an important aspect of this, has some really negative consequences with the emotional, mental health of younger people and probably of their parents at the same time. But that doesn't tell you anything about whether or not we should care that we're having fewer children or not, right? And that seems to be a lot of the concern is more about, well, we're not going to have, as you were saying earlier, we're not going to have enough innovation. We're not going to have enough creativity. We're not going to have enough people buying homes, not enough people buying cars. And what you're talking about seems like a very different conversation.
It's related, though. So what I'm trying to argue is that people in the end, because it's an externality in an economic sense, and it leads to people having fewer children than they would like to. And we actually see this in the data. Polls have been asking about desired fertility, and that has been stable over the last 40 years or so at 2.5 children per woman. So basically, some families wanting 2, others wanting 3, but that's not what we're having. So people are having fewer kids than they would like in some sense. Now, of course, it's always a bit difficult to interpret exactly what that means, what they would like. But this is one reason why so our comparison motives is one reason why the desired fertility and the actual fertility, could diverge. So I think then that's a reason for doing something to help people achieve what they'd like to do without making anyone worse off.
Right.
There's some clear rooms for trade and for benefits.
And what are some of those benefits? You mentioned earlier about, maybe easing up on the education front, but a lot of discussion right now about trying to increase fertility surrounds debates over childcare, supplying more childcare, getting paid while you're a caregiver or earning Social Security benefits while you're caregiving. There's a number of discussions that are out there. So I'm curious what are some of them that you think about?
Yeah, so I mean, clearly the comparison motive is only one reason why fertility is low, and there are other reasons and frictions. At the beginning of this conversation, I was talking about how important it is to combine a career with a family, and that there are factors that make that easy or hard. And so clearly family policy, especially childcare, is one factor in that. Another factor would be the role of fathers, to what extent they're actually involved with children. Another factor are the social norms. Is it even, how does society view working mothers? And so there is policy that it can affect these dimensions, especially the childcare. And that has been shown in research to also increase fertility. Especially many European countries have much more, subsidized childcare or, free public daycare. And there's a lot of evidence that that also stimulates the birth rate. Now, it's not super large, perhaps. And so that's why this other angle now comes in, because it's quite expensive. And the question is it, how many more kids are we creating by subsidizing daycare? Clearly some, but is it worth it? And so maybe this comparison motive angle and thinking about other ways to make it easier for parents to, or cheaper for parents to have children, that's a different angle and maybe not so costly.
So with this comparison angle, what's next? Where are you taking this research? You have a paper coming out that looks at the U.S., South Korea. So what is the question that you're pursuing now with this comparison angle?
Yes, I want to continue trying to figure out how important is it vis-a-vis these other channels. How important is it in the United States? So we're looking for more data, more ways of measuring comparison motives, and to see, is it just relevant in some parts of the world or really everywhere? I doubt it, but we need to see. And then, of course, the obvious question is, why has it increased so much? So why has it changed over time? My hunch is it's related to social media. So think about momfluencers, mommy blogs, that has been fueling these comparison motives. So we need to get some good data on, the importance of mommy blogs, for example, and see how is that related really to the rise of these comparison motives. So that'd be a next project.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. This has been great. It's a fascinating subject.
Well, thank you for this fun conversation.
Michèle Tertilt is an economics professor at Mannheim University and an alum of the University of Minnesota. Office Hours is a production of Matriarch Digital Media, hosted by me, Chris Farrell. Executive producer, Twyla Dang. Producer and editor, Lushik Lotusli. Music by Bob Bradley.
A special thank you to Heller-Hurwitz's Hannah Fairman and Janine Sorrell. Subscribe to Heller-Hurwicz Office Hours to hear about the economic research being done at the University of Minnesota. And to learn more about the research we discussed today, visit hhei@umn.edu. Thanks for listening.